Ralph Blumenthal, great to see you.
Thank you, George.
The Believer's terrific book. You say it's already doing well and it hasn't officially been out yet?
Right. Yeah, it's flying off the shelves, the metaphorical shelves anyway. Pub date is March 15th, but Amazon's already put it on sale, some of the other bookstores. So it's going great guns.
You know, a lot of people in the UFO world today don't really know the name Dr. John Mack anymore. Can you give us sort of the broad strokes of who he was, his professional stature, and why his entry into this weird arena was so important?
Well, good you say that, because I didn't know about John Mack when I first stumbled across him by picking up one of his books in 2004. But in his time, which was the 90s, basically 1990s, he was a household word. He was on Oprah. He met with the Dalai Lama. He met with Yasser Arafat on peace missions to the Middle East. He was everywhere. And mainly, he was in the news because of his research into alien abduction. He was a Harvard psychiatrist, is very esteemed in his field. He had won a Pulitzer Prize with a biography of Lawrence of Arabia, of all things. And that's interesting because he had all these enthusiasms, and he got interested. He saw Lawrence of Arabia. He saw the movie like everybody else, and he said, "I got to find out about this guy." And he ended up doing a 10-year research project, meeting with Lawrence's family, getting his papers. So he won a Pulitzer Prize. So he was known for that. And then with a series of interesting chance encounters, he got interested in the idea of alien abduction. But it was not his field to begin with. He was a psychiatrist, a very conventional one. But by the time he was done with his 2 bestsellers and his TV appearances, he was a household word.
Harvard psychiatrist from a fairly wealthy family, Pulitzer Prize, incredible stature in his field, and yet he goes ahead and tackles this weird subject of alien abductions. Your book, The Believer, is a detailed portrait of Dr. Mack, warts and all, and it's the warts that are so essential to the road that he took in tackling that strange topic of alien abductions, right?
Right. I mean, he was a human being, like all of us. And as I say, actually, in the end of the book, when you talk about, the best of our species, our human species, he would represent that, because he was curious, he was courageous, he went against the grain, he crossed boundaries that other people were afraid to cross. Yeah, and warts and all. I mean, he had his foibles. I mean, he liked women a little too much for a married man. He experimented with drugs. He was very interested in ayahuasca and LSD. He was very naive, actually, when he dealt with the media. You and I know, never confide in a reporter. Keep reporters at arm's length, say exactly what you want to say. But Mack would say things like, well, do you think we should put this in there? You think I should talk about, well, he was talking about his private life, his interest in, all kinds of strange things that you wouldn't necessarily want a reporter to know about. And yet he would let it all hang out and he'd try to make everybody his friend, which was also a problem.
You came to the story, as you mentioned, by finding one of his books, a used book. I think it was Passport to the Cosmos. How did that book hit you? And the timing of when you found it was interesting, because you thought, hey, this would be a good story, right?
Yeah, I was in Texas for the New York Times. I was the Times Southwest correspondent, and I picked up, I was looking for used books, always interested in, what's out there. And I found this book, Passport to the Cosmos, by a guy I'd never heard of, John E. Mack, Harvard psychiatrist. And I read it. And I was dumbfounded that there was a Harvard, academician, highly regarded, whose, main project was investigating encounters with aliens, or what people told him were their encounters with aliens. And so I read the book, and actually this turned out, it was his second book. It was kind of toned down from his first book, which was even more amazing. Anyway, I finished the book. And I said, I got to talk to this guy. He'd make a great interview. So I figured, I'll give him a call in Boston, at Harvard, Cambridge. And then I picked up the paper a few days later and see he was run down in London by a drunk driver. That actually came out later. He was run down, period. And of course, the conspiracy theories abounded that he was assassinated and another John Mack was run down at the exact same time somewhere else. Not true. Anyway, so I was course, very sad to see that, how he ended up, run over at age almost 75, at pretty much the height of his career. So my next step was to call the family and say, gee, I've just been interested in John Mack, and I'd love to get access to his papers and maybe write an article about him. I wasn't even thinking of a book at that point. And of course, it was bad timing because the family was grieving, and that's not what they want to hear from a reporter who wants information. But we kept in touch, and they came around. They were very happy to cooperate. They gave me access to all his personal stuff, including his journals, which were amazing. And psychiatrists have to go through a whole regimen of self-analysis to be a psychiatrist, because they analyze people all the time, so they have to subject themselves to analysis. So he went through a lot of analysis in his training, and even as a famous psychiatrist, he had analysts who he talked to, including a guru, a Sikh, a Hindu wise man who was very helpful to him. And all those sessions were transcribed and recorded, and I had access to that. So I knew what he was saying privately to his own psychiatrist. So anyway, that was the story of how I got into it.
You describe in The Believer that he was initially reluctant to dive into this arena, understandably, given his stature and how weird the topic was, until he met a guy named Bud Hopkins. So can you share that story? What Bud Hopkins conveyed to him that got him on the road to digging into this?
Right. Well, as you said, John was a very conventional psychiatrist. He'd done a lot of work in nightmares and, human behavior, all kinds of foibles, Freudianism, sexuality. But he was a conventional psychiatrist, although he was he was an advocate, he was an activist with all kinds of causes, peace, anti-nuclear, etc. And this enthusiasm, I would find, was sort of the key to his character. It was a short leap from that to alien abduction, but we'll get to that. So the first thing that happened to him along this road was he got involved with a man named Stan Grof, who was a psychiatrist from Czechoslovakia, who got out of communist Czechoslovakia, got a posting at Johns Hopkins, and was very interested in LSD research. And Stan Grof developed, he was a transpersonal psychiatrist, so he was interested in sort of paranormal aspects of psychiatry and the powers of the human spirit. It's a spiritual aspects of psychiatry. So he developed a technique called holotropic breath work, whereby controlling your breathing, which the Sufi masters had apparently mastered centuries ago, thousands of years ago, but by controlling your breathing, you can elevate yourself to different stages of consciousness. It's like taking a drug without taking a drug. So he attended some of Stan Grof's breathing sessions at Esalen on the West Coast and different places. And he fell in with a group of people who were also interested in these breathing sessions, including a fellow psychiatrist named Blanche Chubasti, who started telling him about one of her patients who had all these weird experiences. And Blanche recognized these experiences as sort of alien abduction experiences, but Mack didn't know anything about that, so he didn't recognize that. But she said, John, I have a friend named Bud Hopkins, who's an artist from Cape Cod and a very respectable artist too. And he's doing a lot of research in alien abduction. And would you like to see him? And John said, of course not. This sounds crazy, which is everybody's reaction. What? Anyway, then something strange happened. John Mack was visiting his good friend, Robert Lifton, the well-known psychiatrist and writer on Nazi war criminals, and Hiroshima. Studied the after effects of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Lifton is a sainted name in the annals of psychology. Anyway, he was a friend of John's from Harvard. John was visiting him, and surprisingly, or the way these weird things happen, John thought about Bud Hopkins, who was also in New York, and decided to give him a call. And he said to Robert Lifton, who knew Bud Hopkins from Cape Cod, because psychiatrists, practice in Cape Cod in the summer and artists work there. So they knew each other. Turned out better than John even realized. But anyway, John said to Robert Lifton, I'm going to give this guy, Bud Hopkins, a call. And he did. And Bud invited him over. And he said, would you like to come along? He said to Lifton. And Lifton's wife pops up and says, no. She says, no. She says, Bob has a choice in all this and you don't. Whoa. I mean, that's like, Cassandra speaking. So, so John Mack goes off by himself to Bud Hopkins' townhouse on the west side. And it's a townhouse hung with Bud Hopkins sculptures, very strange sculptures, sort of knife-bladed, brightly colored sculptures. He called his guardians, like they were guarding him. And he shows John letters he's gotten from people describing all these strange encounters with aliens. And Mack doesn't know what to make of it, but Bud Hopkins says, look, take a bunch of these letters and read them whenever you have a chance and see what you think. That was it. So that was his initiation to it. And then a lot of things happened as a result of that, but it was a chance encounter, as so much in life is. It was serendipity. It was, weird chance. Anyway, or maybe it was written, maybe it was foreordained. But anyway, that was his entree into alien abduction. And, a lot of things followed from that.
Bud Hopkins was, as you say, a successful artist, but he had taken this on because he started hearing the stories. He had had his own UFO sighting that you describe in the book. He started taking this on because no one else was doing it. He wrote a couple of books, Missing Time. He coined that phrase. It's now well known in the field. He wanted some help from somebody like Dr. John Mack and someone his stature, right? Right.
Yeah, that's very important. That because Bud Hopkins was self-taught in hypnosis. His story is very interesting by itself. I mean, he had spotted a UFO in Cape Cod in the 60s. He was just on his way to a party, sees this thing in the sky. He gets to the party and he says, hey, guess what we saw in the sky? And everybody at the party chimed, oh, we saw one too. We saw one too. So he's thinking, whoa, this is interesting. So he starts to read up on it. Then, this is a really interesting story that I tell in the book. Hopkins goes to his wine store in his neighborhood one day, and the guy is all shook up, the owner. But what's the matter? And the guy says, this is a crazy story. He says, I closed up one night. I'm driving home to New Jersey. And as he's getting close to his home in New Jersey, the radio starts to fizz and fritz. And he sees this UFO landing near him. He goes to take a look and he sees a giant ship landing in a little park on the Hudson River. Little figures like children size get out and start digging in the soil. And he's completely freaked out. The next day he goes back and he finds holes in the soil where he saw these little creatures digging. So then he's really freaked out. And he tells the story to Bud. And Bud writes it up for the Village Voice, which is it's coming back actually, Counterculture Weekly, very famous paper, very courageous.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what started Bud off. And then, as you say, he got into this whole idea. He basically invented the idea of missing time. People who get involved with UFOs and aliens suddenly find that they can't account for a few hours. And then later on in hypnosis or whatever, it comes back to them, these unbelievable experiences that happened, while they were in some other, state of being, let's say. But Bud really, pioneered that stuff.
Dr. Mack, of course, he hears this. Eventually, he takes a deep dive into it. He's holding sessions at his home, interviewing patients, doing hypnosis sessions, collecting information. He shares that with the world eventually, and we'll get to the repercussions of that in a moment. But he, as you describe in your book, there's this incredible 5-day conference at MIT where he becomes the star, where he shares this with all of his colleagues, many of whom want to suggest alternate explanations, sleep paralysis, mental illness, those kind of things. Dr. Mack develops 5 criteria that he said, if you're going to have have a counter theory on what explains these alien abductions, they have to meet these criteria. So can you share with us the criteria?
Yeah, Mack did approach it scientifically, and that's why a subtitle of the book is Alien Encounters Hard Science. and the Passion of John Mack. So I do give more than a nod to science here, because I'm not just taking what he says, at face value. We're comparing it to, scientific theory and what acknowledged scientists have to say about it. To keep up the story, I mean, after he met Bud Hopkins, he collected his own group of so-called experiencers. That's the word that they used because it's neutral. You don't know what they experience. They experience something. So he collects these people, collects their stories, and he finds out that there's a physicist at MIT named David Pritchard who got very interested in alien abduction. And Pritchard is a no-nonsense physicist. I mean, he basically did groundbreaking work with atoms and lasers and the light properties of atoms. And he mentored Nobel Prize winners. I mean, he's a real heavyweight. So he decides he's going to put together this conference on alien abduction. He's interested in it. So he asks MIT, can I get some space here? And he works at MIT, and of course they want to say no, but he puts them in a tough spot. He says, look, it's a freedom of speech thing. You're not endorsing, you're not sponsoring the conference. You're just giving us a space for it. Well, we'll pay for it. So they ended up saying yes, and he convened this big group of very distinguished scientists, theologians, psychologists, psychiatrists, and Mack was a co-sponsor, but he had a guy named Phil Morrison who, really played a key role in putting together the atomic bomb that was dropped on Japan. So he had a lot of heavyweights at this conference, and they examined the phenomenon of alien abduction from every conceivable vantage point. Is it folklore? What science is there? What proof has come forward in terms of evidence left behind? And they put all this out 2 years later in a book, which is really required reading for anybody who wants to understand this field. But anyway, Mack participates in the conference, which was secret at the time. I mean, they invited a very well-known author, C.B.D. Bryan, who wrote Friendly Fire about Vietnam, but they all basically pledged to secrecy until the conference was over. And Bryan wrote a book about, Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind, about that conference. Anyway, so for a week at MIT, all these people are debating, aliens and alien abduction, and it's extraordinary, and that gives a good, sort of scientific overview of what was known and what was not known about the phenomenon.
Basically, Mack says, look, there may be explanations for some of these things, but to explain them all, your theory has to account for X, Y, Z, 5 different things, right?
Right. Yeah. So what he did was, look, he said, I'm a psychiatrist, so my specialty is the human psyche and the human mind. So I can tell you certain things. These people are not crazy. They're not mentally ill, because he's interviewed so many. He said, that's what I do for a living, so I know this. These people are not making it up. They're not fabricating it. It's not a hoax, because I've looked into enough of these stories. I know what, people say. So he said, as you say, he developed these 5 criteria that sort of explain the common denominators of these mystical, mysterious experiences. One is there's a basic consistency to these accounts. Happen in different places to different people all over the world, but there's a kind of a general playbook that they all agree on. Secondly, it happens to small children, sometimes 2 years old or so. They come back, they tell these stories about being taken up to the sky by a little man. And you can't say, as Mack argued, that these kids are influenced by movies that they've seen or the cultural milieu or books they've read. These are little kids, they're telling these stories. Now, it doesn't mean everything a kid says is true, but again, these stories were kind of consistent. And it was interesting that they would even have, these so-called memories, which Mack thought were real memories of something. There was evidence, Mack said. There was fragmentary evidence. Some people had scars on their body they couldn't explain. There was a quadriplegic who had scars on his body. He couldn't have done it to himself. He couldn't move. And there was there were areas where UFOs were reported to have been seen and landed, where the ground, showed up with different kinds of, measurements afterwards. Different effects were detected afterwards. Grass wouldn't grow, certain patterns, etc. So there was that evidence. And then there was the association with UFOs, that people usually, before they were abducted, they noticed some kind of a vehicle, something that they followed or that followed them. So he said these are the general points that any theory has to explain. And you can come up with any theory you want on alien abduction, what it is, but it has to fit these examples, these experiences that people have actually had. So that was his great gift, was that he kind of formulated some hypothesis, some approach to this.
I think, I don't know if you found it in his journals, if there's a moment at which he realizes, holy crap, this stuff could be real. Maybe you've had a moment like that. I know I have, in looking into these subjects. It's not, at some point, it doesn't just become a news story. You realize, hey, there's really something going on here.
Yeah, well, it is a real mystery. And, and so far, no one has solved it. I mean, really, people have come close to it. We've made a lot of progress, as we now see from the Navy videos. People are not talking anymore about the reality of UFOs. Do you believe in UFOs? What do you believe? I mean, the Navy has videos. There's radar tracks of these objects. We don't know what they are. We don't know where they come from. We don't know who's behind the wheel, if anybody or anything, but there are objects that have been detected. So these are not figments of imagination, as writers have said for many years. Oh, it's optical illusions. It's not. They are real objects which no one can figure out.
The other central story you tell in The Believer is how Dr. Mack's interest in abductions got him into serious trouble with Harvard. It led to a gigantic fight that essentially was about academic freedom. Can you give us the broad strokes of that?
Yeah, it's really interesting that, you would think that sooner or later he would come into a clash with Harvard. Harvard has a whole history of unconventional research. William James, the father of psychology, was investigating seances, 100 years ago, 100 years before Mack, and not only got away with it, I mean, he's lionized for his groundbreaking research into parapsychology and anomalies. So Harvard was no stranger to strange research, and Leary and Alpert were promoting LSD while at Harvard. That eventually got into trouble for that. But so Harvard was no what should we say, ivory tower where this kind of strange research couldn't be imagined. But what Harvard's medical school superiors faulted Mack on was being too enthusiastic. They said that he really got into the stories with his patients, and he didn't distance himself. He didn't say, well, this may not be real. He threw himself into it to the point where he became identified with that. Rightly or wrongly, that's how he was perceived at Harvard. So he wrote a book, his first book, called Abduction, where he tells all these stories. And Harvard, that didn't sit too well with Harvard. First of all, it was a bestseller, and academicians do not like it when one of their colleagues writes a bestseller. There's some professional jealousy that enters. Come on, let's face it. And then he was on Oprah, which they didn't like. And he was on a lot of TV shows because he let it all hang out. He wasn't shy about, bringing his experiencers, his abductees with him and telling their stories. So Harvard eventually decided they have to investigate his relationships with his patients, whether he was enabling them, whether he was following scientific method, whatever that is, because the greatest scientific advances have been made, without following, quote, scientific method. So, and that Mack made that point. What the hell is scientific method? Tell Einstein, you're not following scientific method, when you're postulating about gravity. Anyway, so they convened a committee to investigate. It was a secret committee. I call it kind of an inquisition. And it was headed by a very eminent doctor of medicine, Arnold Relman, who was the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, very well-regarded leader at Harvard, but who was a total skeptic about alien abduction, about UFOs, his view of reality, it's safe to say, was if you can't, touch it, quantify it, taste it, feel it, it can't be real. It has to have some, footprint in the physical world. So they put Mack through a long process of interviewing him and his abductees, his experiencers, and other and colleagues or so, and in the end, he was basically exonerated. They said, we haven't found anything wrong. You were a little too enthusiastic, which Mack agreed. Yeah, I was. But he got off with no real discipline, and meanwhile, it cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal costs, and it upset him terribly, obviously. But that's the story, and I got the records of that inquest or inquisition or whatever you want to call it from Mack's emails, from memos exchanged with his lawyers. Harvard never put out a report on this, because it was a secret process, for better or worse. I mean, you could argue it both ways. Alan Dershowitz defended Mack in terms of his academic freedom to pursue this. But one of the things I'm proudest of in this book is putting together a story like this that was not public, has never been made public, but I pieced it together from memos, his own journals, his own records, a manuscript he wrote that was never published, and that tells the story.
Yeah, it's essential reading. That I don't want to give away too much of it, but how you put that all together. I mean, some of us knew the broad strokes, the general outline, but the details about that battle, it's just epic. Toward the end of his life, as you mentioned before, Passport to the Cosmos, Mack, more philosophical alien force or race or whatever they are, what it teaches us about ourselves, about the nature of reality, about our place in the cosmos, really profound stuff.
Yeah, he had what I like to say is there's a progression to his story. He went from one thing to another thing. So in the beginning, he was very centered on social justice on Earth, improving conditions for mental health patients in Cambridge. And then he went on to finding peace in the Middle East. And as I say, he met with Yasser Arafat, and he wrote the book on Lawrence of Arabia. And then he protested nuclear weapons, and he went out to your state.
Got arrested out here. Yeah.
And he got arrested there and with his family protesting nuclear weapons because he thought that there was a great danger to humanity. As a doctor, he saw there was a great danger to humanity and the oversupply of nuclear arms. And he made inroads to the Russians. He made friends with the Russians. So he had these series of enthusiasms. So then he got into alien abduction through the stories he heard, but he didn't stop there. He continued to be interested in anomalies like crop circles. I mean, what the hell are crop circles? Some of them are hoaxes, some of them are not. They appear, they're, symmetrical. Cattle mutilations, what's that all about? The Holy Grail religion he got interested in, even he was Jewish, but he was interested in, there's a stone that he found, the Moldavite, a green stone that has supposedly magical properties that he was very interested in. So he started investigating. He went far afield. He realized that there are a lot of strange things. And actually, I think, as I say in the book, The Believer, that his mistake in the beginning was focusing exclusively on abductions and not looking at the broader picture of anomalies. Like there's a guy, David Hufford, who investigated the old hag syndrome, where people wake up and they feel a evil presence is pressing down on them, suffocating them. This has been around for thousands of years, and Mack didn't really deal with that. But anyway, in the end, he did go. He made full circle, and he started looking at all the other strange things that were going on, including at the very end of his life after death. He got very interested in a story of a colleague, brilliant young colleague, who had kind of supernormal gifts to see things that were far away, remote viewing. And she ended up dying early of brain cancer. And there were stories that Mack got from her husband and friends that she reappeared in various forms afterwards, So he got interested in life after death. And as I say in the book, as maybe you're going to get to this, he himself was supposedly seen after he died by different people. And I say, I can't verify that. I'm not going there, but these are stories that people tell.
You know, you know a little bit about pushback from dealing with controversial subjects. You co-wrote this article in the New York Times, December 2017, that absolutely changed everything for the UFO subject because of the stature of the New York Times. It made it acceptable for other mainstream media to cover it. That affected the willingness of Congress to get briefings and speak about this openly. Tremendously influential article and subsequent articles. But how hard was it to get that to get it on the front page, get it past the editors, and have you had professional or personal blowback since then?
Well, there is a ridicule factor to this reporting that we all face, as you know, George. You walk past colleagues and they make weird sounds and things like that. So you deal with that. The thing with the Times is I was there a long time before I wrote these articles, and I know what the Times process of vetting articles involves. So Leslie Kane and I and Helene Cooper, when we broached the idea to the editors, we were very comfortable in knowing that everybody was on the record. There were no anonymous sources. Everything was documented. We had, in writing from different people. We had reports. We didn't ask the editors to accept anything on faith. Everything was documented. But it was still a difficult topic for the Times to grapple with. And the Times has a history of being very skeptical of UFOs, as you know. And a lot of the articles that have appeared over the years have been snotty. They've been, sarcastic but on the other hand, there have been other articles over the years that the Times has run that have been solid and interesting and, well reported, etc. But the Times is not the first place you'd go to place a UFO article. Let's face it. Anyway, but I think the way we laid it out to the editors, and we did go through a difficult process. We had to, prove various things to our editors and show them and reword things that made the article stronger in the end. But I must say they were very supportive throughout. The article did appear on the front page on December 17, 2017. It did cause an uproar because it was the Times, but nobody questioned the reporting in it, and nobody said this was wrong or we got something wrong or this was speculative or so. It was all solid, and we've gone on, as you said, since then to publish other articles that were also reports of pilots who encountered things, and we'd like to continue our reporting, but it's got to be right. And, we get a lot of pushback from the UFO community too. Like, when are you going to write your next article? Why don't you say this? Why don't you say that? Who's censoring the New York Times? Say, come on, give us a break, one step at a time.
One other question. You recently wrote just a fascinating article, a profile of Robert Bigelow, who knew Dr. John Mack, supported him financially in some of his research. And it occurred to me after I read The Believer, the parallel paths that those two men traveled, both interested in UFOs, animal mutilations, crop circles, all that stuff, and have ended up toward Bigelow most recently, and Dr. Mack at the end of his life, looking at the afterlife. That article was terrific. We'll attach it to this story, but it's interesting, the parallels of the two men.
Yeah, well, one of the things that Robert Bigelow said in that 60 Minutes interview, he was asked, do you believe in aliens and this and that? And he made no apologies for what he was doing and how he was putting his fortune to work. He said, I'm going to follow my instincts, and I'm not afraid. Yeah, I encounter ridicule, and people make fun of this and people make fun of that, but I don't care. I don't even pay any attention to it. And I think that's correct. Mack was like that. And as you say, Robert Bigelow did fund research for Mack in a famous poll. And Mack had another billionaire who has two billionaires supporting them. I'd like to have one. Mack had Lawrence Rockefeller, who also famously believed in researching anomalies, gave a lot of his money to people researching fringe issues, let's say. And I tell a story in the book where Lawrence Rockefeller was once hosting Bill and Hillary Clinton at his ranch in Wyoming. And he took the occasion to lobby Bill, I think Bill was president then, about opening up the CIA files on, UFOs and being more forthcoming from the government. And afterwards, as I tell in the book, Lawrence tells the story that Hillary approaches him afterwards and said, that stuff you said to Bill about UFOs or so, don't ever bring that up again. And Lawrence Rockefeller, later talking, I believe, to Whitley Strieber, said, hey, if it wasn't real, she wouldn't have said that. Anyway.
Ralph, The Believer is a terrific book. I encourage everybody to read it. It really taught me a lot of things about Dr. Mack that I had no idea about. I didn't know him for a little bit back in those days. Thanks for joining us, and we'll get this story out, and best of luck to you.
Well, George, thank you. You're a great pioneer in this field, and you've done a lot to bring this issue to light. So thank you again so much for all you've done.
Thanks.